The courtroom buzzed with subdued whispers, the low hum of anticipation weaving through the air like an unspoken storm. Judge Eleanor Hart adjusted her robe with meticulous precision, her practiced hands smoothing the fabric into place. Her reputation preceded her, sharp, fair, and unyielding. Today, however, something about the case before her tugged at the edges of her otherwise steadfast demeanor. As Eleanor settled into her high-backed chair, the wooden gavel and anchor at her fingertips, she surveyed the room. The prosecution team sat confidently at their table, their stack of evidence neatly organized in pristine binders. Across from them, the defense team appeared less sure, their shoulders hunched, papers scattered haphazardly. In the middle of it all sat the defendant, Daniel Cross. Eleanor's breath hitched the moment she saw him. Though the years had chiseled away the soft features of youth, there was no mistaking the man sitting before her. Time had added lines to his face, a weariness to his eyes, but she would recognize him anywhere. Daniel. Her best friend from a lifetime ago. The memory was immediate, visceral, and unrelenting. Two children, knee-deep in mud by the riverbank, laughing as they plotted their escape from the drudgery of their troubled lives. Someday, Daniel had said, his voice fierce and certain, "We'll get out of this place. I'll make sure of it." Now, here he was, not as the triumphant figure she'd imagined all those years ago, but as a man accused of a crime so severe it had captured national attention. Eleanor's heart clenched. "Your Honor?" The voice of the court clerk pulled her back to the present. Eleanor blinked, masking her brief lapse with the stoic expression she was known for. "Proceed," she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. She picked up her gavel and rapped it once, the sound echoing through the chamber. "The court is now in session." As the charges were read, Eleanor's mind warred with itself. Daniel Cross, accused of orchestrating a corporate embezzlement scheme that had defrauded investors of millions. The evidence against him seemed damning on paper. Falsified records, hidden accounts, a web of deceit spanning years. Yet, as Eleanor's eyes flicked to him, she couldn't reconcile the boy she'd known with the man the prosecution described. She forced herself to focus as the lead prosecutor, a polished woman with a razor-sharp tone, began laying out her case. Eleanor took notes methodically, her pen moving in precise strokes. But beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. How had Daniel ended up here? Had he truly committed these acts, or was there more to the story? When the prosecution paused, the defense team rose. Daniel's lawyer, a wiry man with a nervous energy, began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "what we have here is a man who has been wrongfully accused. A man who trusted the wrong people and is now paying the price for their greed." Eleanor's eyes drifted to Daniel again. He sat motionless, his expression unreadable. But when their gazes met, just for a moment, Eleanor saw a flicker of recognition. Her stomach tightened. Did he remember her? Or was she just another face in the room, another figure in the machinery of justice grinding against him? The day unfolded in a blur of testimony and evidence presentation. Eleanor listened intently, her judicial mask firmly in place, but her mind couldn't stop wandering to the past. She remembered the nights they'd spent huddled under the stars, dreaming of better days. She remembered the day he'd vanished from her life without explanation, leaving her to wonder if she'd ever see him again. During the lunch recess, Eleanor retreated to her chambers. She sat at her desk, staring at the case files before her but unable to focus. Her hands shook as she reached for her tea, spilling a few drops onto the papers. She muttered a curse under her breath. "Get it together, Hart," she told herself. She'd faced high-profile cases before. She'd sentenced people to life in prison, handed down decisions that changed lives forever. But this was different. It was personal and it terrified her. As the afternoon session began, the prosecution called their first witness, a financial analyst who detailed the fraudulent transactions tied to Daniel. Eleanor's focus sharpened as she listened, her legal mind working to dissect every claim, every piece of evidence. But as the witness droned on, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Daniel had leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His lips moved imperceptibly as if he were speaking to himself. Or was he speaking to her? When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, pretending to review her notes as the room emptied. She watched as Daniel was led out by the bailiff, his posture slumped but his head held high. The sight of him stirred something deep within her, a mixture of nostalgia, guilt, and an overwhelming need to understand. Back in her chambers, Eleanor paced. She knew she was walking a dangerous line. Judges were supposed to remain impartial, to separate their personal lives from the cases before them. But how could she do that now? How could she sit in judgment of a man who'd once been her closest friend? A knock at the door startled her. It was her clerk, a young woman with a knack for sensing when something was amiss. "Everything okay, Your Honor?" the clerk asked, her voice cautious. Eleanor forced a smile. "Fine. Just a long day." The clerk hesitated but nodded. "If you need anything, let me know." When the door closed, Eleanor sat down heavily. She stared at the case files, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now. Not ever. Yet, as the moonlight filtered through her window, illuminating the stacks of evidence, one thought refused to leave her mind. What if Daniel was innocent? The courtroom was silent the next morning, an almost oppressive stillness hanging in the air. Judge Eleanor Hart took her seat on the bench, her demeanor as composed as ever. But inside her thoughts churned. The image of Daniel Cross, her childhood friend turned defendant, was etched into her mind. She had barely slept, the weight of her role pressing heavily on her conscience. The court clerk rose to announce the proceedings. "The People versus Daniel Cross," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. Eleanor straightened her spine and lifted her gavel, signaling the start of the day's session. The prosecutor, Margaret Duval, stood with confidence. A seasoned attorney with a reputation for relentless pursuit of justice, she addressed the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we are here today to hold Mr. Daniel Cross accountable for his actions. Actions that have left countless lives in disarray." Margaret gestured to the evidence table, where binders, charts, and digital screens waited to support her case. "This is a case of calculated deception. Mr. Cross, a man trusted by his colleagues and investors alike, orchestrated a scheme that defrauded innocent people of millions of dollars. We will prove that his actions were deliberate and motivated by greed." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though her heart sank at the prosecutor's words. She glanced briefly at Daniel, who sat at the defense table, his face impassive. Was this man truly capable of such betrayal? The Daniel she had known would have risked everything to protect those around him. Had life changed him so profoundly? The prosecutor's opening statement unfolded with precision, each word calculated to sway the jury. She outlined the evidence: falsified financial records, offshore accounts linked to Daniel, and testimony from former associates who claimed to have been coerced into participating in his scheme. Margaret concluded with a pointed statement: "Justice demands accountability. And today we will deliver it." As Margaret sat down, the defense attorney, Edward Chase, rose. His movements were less assured, his presence less commanding. Eleanor's judicial instincts told her he was outmatched, and her concern for Daniel deepened. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Edward began, his voice tinged with nervous energy. "What the prosecution has presented is a compelling narrative, but it is just that, a narrative. Mr. Cross is not the villain they've painted him to be. He is a victim of circumstance, scapegoated by those who seek to hide their own culpability." Edward's argument was passionate but scattered, lacking the polish and precision of Margaret's delivery. He promised to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, to show that the evidence was circumstantial at best. "At the heart of this trial," he said, "is a man who trusted the wrong people. A man who, like all of us, made mistakes but does not deserve to be vilified for crimes he did not commit." Eleanor watched Daniel's reaction closely. He sat rigid, his hands folded on the table, his expression a mask of calm. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of resolve, a quiet defiance, that hinted at the man she had once known. The first witness took the stand, a financial analyst who had worked closely with Daniel during the period in question. Margaret led the examination with precision, guiding the witness through a series of damning revelations. They described discrepancies in financial records, transactions routed through offshore accounts, and a paper trail that pointed directly to Daniel. "In your professional opinion," Margaret asked, her tone measured but firm, "were these actions consistent with someone attempting to conceal fraudulent activity?" "Yes," the analyst replied. "The patterns are clear. These were not accidental errors but deliberate manipulations." Eleanor took meticulous notes, her mind racing. The evidence was compelling, but it wasn't airtight. There were gaps, inconsistencies that Edward could exploit, if he had the skill to do so. When it was Edward's turn to cross-examine, his approach was hesitant. He questioned the analyst's methods, attempting to cast doubt on their findings, but his efforts lacked focus. The jury's expressions ranged from skeptical to disengaged, and Eleanor felt a pang of frustration. If Daniel were innocent, he deserved better representation. The day's proceedings continued with a parade of witnesses, each adding another layer to the prosecution's case. Former colleagues testified about Daniel's role in key decisions, his alleged manipulation of the company's finances, and his increasingly secretive behavior in the months leading up to the scandal's revelation. Margaret's strategy was clear: to paint a picture of a man who had systematically betrayed the trust of everyone around him. Eleanor's thoughts drifted as she listened, her mind tugged back to memories of their childhood. She remembered Daniel's fierce loyalty, his unyielding determination to protect her from the harsh realities of their world. Could that same boy have grown into the man the prosecution described? During a brief recess, Eleanor retreated to her chambers. She closed the door and leaned against it, her breath shallow. The weight of the case pressed down on her, the lines between her duty as a judge and her personal history blurring in ways she had never experienced. A knock at the door startled her. It was her clerk, a perceptive young woman named Claire. "Your Honor, are you all right?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with concern. Eleanor straightened, masking her inner turmoil. "I'm fine, Claire. Just reviewing the case." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "If you need anything, let me know." When the recess ended, Eleanor returned to the bench, her resolve hardened. She could not allow her personal connection to Daniel to influence her judgment. Yet, as the prosecution called its final witness of the day, a former accountant for the company, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The accountant described a meeting where Daniel had allegedly pressured them to falsify records. He said it was necessary, the witness testified. That it was the only way to keep the company afloat. Margaret pressed further. "Did Mr. Cross offer any justification for these actions?" "He claimed it was temporary," the accountant replied. "But I knew it was wrong. I should have spoken up sooner." The statement hung in the air, a damning indictment of Daniel's character. Eleanor's pen hovered over her notebook, the words blurring before her eyes. She forced herself to focus, to record the details with the same diligence she applied to every case. But her heart ached with the weight of doubt and uncertainty. As the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, watching as Daniel was led away. He glanced back at her, their eyes meeting briefly. In that moment she saw something in his gaze, not fear, not guilt, but a quiet plea for understanding. Eleanor returned to her chambers, her mind racing. The prosecution's case was strong, but it wasn't infallible. There were questions that hadn't been answered, gaps that begged to be filled. And beneath it all, there was the undeniable truth of who Daniel had once been to her. That night, as she sat at her desk, reviewing the day's testimony, Eleanor made a decision. She would approach this case with the same rigor and impartiality she brought to every trial. But she would also seek the truth wherever it led her. For Daniel. For justice. And for herself. The courtroom's heavy oak doors groaned as they closed behind Judge Eleanor Hart that evening. The echoes of the day's testimony lingered in her mind, a cacophony of voices, accusations, and unresolved questions. She descended the courthouse steps slowly, her heels clicking against the cold marble, her thoughts consumed by Daniel Cross and the life they had shared before it had all fallen apart. Her driver waited at the curb, the dark car idling in the fading light. Eleanor slid into the back seat, exhaustion pulling at her features. "Home, please," she murmured. But as the car rolled forward, she found herself saying, "Actually, take me to the Riverside Library." The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror but said nothing, adjusting course without a word. Eleanor leaned back against the seat, her eyes closing briefly as memories stirred unbidden. 25 years earlier. The small, run-down town of Riverside had been a place of faded dreams and whispered regrets. Eleanor and Daniel had both been children of that forgotten town, tethered to its decay but dreaming of escape. They had spent countless hours together, huddled in the dusty stacks of the Riverside Library, their refuge from a world that seemed determined to swallow them whole. Eleanor could still remember the sound of Daniel's laughter, bright and defiant, as he sketched elaborate plans for their future on the backs of borrowed books. "We'll leave this place," he would say, his voice filled with conviction. "You'll be a lawyer. A judge even. And I don't know yet. But it'll be something big. Something good." But their dreams had been fractured by reality. Daniel's family, already teetering on the edge of ruin, had collapsed under the weight of debt and scandal. One day, without warning, he had disappeared, leaving behind only an empty seat in their usual corner of the library. The car pulled to a stop outside the library, its once proud facade now crumbling with age. Eleanor stepped out, her breath visible in the crisp night air. She climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy doors, the scent of old books and varnish greeting her like an old friend. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, looked up from her desk. "Judge Hart," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you here at this hour?" Eleanor managed a faint smile. "Just reminiscing," she said. "Is the archive room still open?" The librarian nodded, gesturing down a dimly lit hallway. "Take all the time you need." Eleanor found the archive room exactly as she remembered it, rows of dusty shelves, each crammed with records and remnants of the town's history. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her thoughts drifting to Daniel. What had become of him after he'd left? Had the world been kinder to him than it had to her? She found what she was looking for in a corner shelf, an old yearbook from their high school days. She flipped through the pages until she found their class photo. There they were, side by side, two faces brimming with hope and defiance. Eleanor traced her finger over Daniel's image, her chest tightening with a mixture of longing and regret. "What happened to you?" she whispered. Back at her home later that night, Eleanor sat in her study, the yearbook open on her desk. She stared at the photo until the lines and faces blurred, her mind churning with questions. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to find them in court transcripts or witness testimonies. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the courthouse early, her steps brisk and purposeful. She found her clerk, Claire, already at her desk. "Claire," Eleanor said, "I need you to pull some records for me. Anything you can find on Daniel Cross's life before the indictment. Financial records, employment history, personal connections. Everything." Claire frowned. "Your Honor, is that appropriate? Given the circumstances?" Eleanor hesitated. Claire wasn't wrong. Delving into a defendant's background outside of official proceedings was a slippery slope. But Eleanor's instincts told her there was more to this case than met the eye. "It's not for the trial," she said finally. "It's personal." Claire nodded reluctantly. "I'll see what I can do." By lunchtime, Claire returned with a stack of documents. "This is everything I could find," she said, placing the files on Eleanor's desk. "It's not much, but it's a start." Eleanor sifted through the papers, her eyes scanning for anything that might provide clarity. There were employment records from various companies, most of which ended abruptly under questionable circumstances. Financial statements showed a pattern of instability, with large sums appearing and disappearing with little explanation. Then there was a newspaper clipping from 10 years earlier. Local man Daniel Cross rescues family from house fire. The accompanying photo showed a younger, thinner Daniel, his face smudged with soot but his expression resolute. The article praised his bravery, describing how he had risked his life to save a mother and her 2 children trapped inside. Eleanor stared at the clipping, a lump forming in her throat. This was the Daniel she remembered, the boy who had always put others before himself no matter the cost. But how had he gone from a hero to an accused criminal? The next day in court, Eleanor's demeanor was as composed as ever, but her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. The prosecution called another witness, a forensic accountant who had analyzed the fraudulent transactions. The evidence was detailed, technical, and damning. Eleanor listened carefully, her pen moving swiftly across her notebook. When it was Edward Chase's turn to cross-examine, he stumbled through a series of poorly phrased questions, failing to undermine the witness's testimony. Eleanor's frustration grew. Daniel deserved better representation than this. As the session drew to a close, Eleanor watched Daniel closely. He seemed resigned, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. But when their eyes met, something flickered in his expression, a quiet plea, a glimmer of the boy she had once known. That evening, Eleanor returned to the archive room at the library. She pored over old records and newspapers, piecing together fragments of Daniel's life. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that his path had been anything but straightforward. Triumphs and tragedies were interwoven, each step marked by struggle and resilience. By the time she left, the library was dark and silent, the only sound the soft rustle of papers in her bag. As she stepped into the night, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth about Daniel Cross, no matter where it led her. Because beneath the shadows of the past, she knew there was light. And she was determined to find it. The courtroom's atmosphere had grown tense, thick with anticipation. As the trial entered its fourth day, Judge Eleanor Hart could feel the mounting pressure from all sides. The prosecution's relentless pursuit, the defense's faltering strategy, and the jury's growing skepticism. Each moment brought Daniel Cross closer to a verdict, and Eleanor found herself grappling with the ethical boundaries of her role and the haunting memories of their shared past. That morning, the prosecution's lead attorney, Margaret Duval, approached the bench with a confidence that had become her trademark. She carried a small stack of papers, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Your Honor," Margaret began, her voice clear and commanding, "we would like to introduce new evidence that further establishes the defendant's involvement in the embezzlement scheme. These documents were recently authenticated and corroborate previous testimony regarding offshore accounts linked to Mr. Cross." Eleanor accepted the papers, her expression neutral, and quickly scanned their contents. They detailed a series of transactions, meticulously recorded, that painted a damning picture of financial deceit. She glanced briefly at Daniel, whose face remained unreadable, then turned her attention back to Margaret. "The evidence is admissible," Eleanor said, tapping her gavel lightly. "Proceed." Margaret wasted no time, calling her next witness, a forensic accountant who had analyzed the newly discovered documents. The expert's testimony was thorough, walking the jury through each transaction with precision. Charts and graphs appeared on the courtroom's digital displays, each one reinforcing the narrative that Daniel had orchestrated a complex web of financial deception. From the bench, Eleanor observed the jury's reactions. Some leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they processed the evidence. Others exchanged glances, their skepticism toward Daniel growing with each passing minute. The weight of the testimony was undeniable, and Eleanor's chest tightened as she watched Daniel's defense team scramble to prepare their response. Edward Chase, Daniel's attorney, rose for cross-examination. His nervous energy was palpable, his movements hurried and uncoordinated. "Mr. Graves," he began, addressing the forensic accountant, "these transactions you've described, isn't it possible that they could have been initiated by someone other than my client?" The accountant adjusted his glasses, his demeanor calm and professional. "The accounts in question were created using credentials tied directly to Mr. Cross. While it's theoretically possible that someone else accessed them, the likelihood is minimal given the security measures in place." Edward's attempts to cast doubt were clumsy at best, and Margaret's objections came swiftly, cutting him off before he could gain any momentum. Eleanor fought the urge to intervene, reminding herself of her duty to remain impartial. Still, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that Edward was out of his depth, leaving Daniel vulnerable to the prosecution's onslaught. During the lunch recess, Eleanor retreated to her chambers. The morning's testimony replayed in her mind, each piece of evidence stacking higher against Daniel. She stared at the stack of files on her desk, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Memories of Daniel's fierce loyalty as a boy clashed with the damning image of him painted in court. Who was the real Daniel Cross? A knock at the door startled her. It was Claire, her ever-reliable clerk, carrying a folder. "Your Honor, I thought you'd want to see this," Claire said, placing the folder on the desk. "It's more information about Mr. Cross's financial dealings. I did some digging as you requested." Eleanor hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were records that painted a more nuanced picture of Daniel's financial activities. While some transactions aligned with the prosecution's narrative, others suggested a pattern of charitable donations and personal sacrifices. Significant sums had been funneled into community projects, education funds, and aid organizations, all anonymously. "He's not the monster they're making him out to be," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely audible. Claire tilted her head, her expression curious. "Do you think he's innocent?" Eleanor closed the folder, her mind racing. "I don't know," she admitted. "But there's more to this story than what we're seeing in court." The afternoon session began with a new witness for the defense. Edward Chase called a former colleague of Daniel's to the stand, a man named Peter Lang. Peter was visibly nervous, his hands fidgeting as he took the oath. "Mr. Lang," Edward began, "can you describe your professional relationship with Mr. Cross?" Peter cleared his throat. "I worked under Daniel at Apex Solutions. He was my direct supervisor for 3 years. How would you characterize his leadership?" Peter hesitated, glancing at Daniel. "He was firm but fair. He pushed us to meet high standards, but he also looked out for his team. If someone was struggling, he'd step in to help." Edward smiled faintly, sensing an opportunity. "Did you ever witness Mr. Cross engage in any unethical behavior?" "No," Peter said firmly. "If anything, he was the one who kept the rest of us in line. He'd shut down anything that seemed even slightly questionable." Margaret stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculative and irrelevant." Eleanor's gavel struck the bench. "Sustained. Mr. Chase, please keep your questions focused." Edward nodded, his confidence faltering. "Mr. Lang, do you believe Mr. Cross is capable of the crimes he's accused of?" Peter's gaze shifted to the jury, then back to Edward. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "It doesn't sound like him." As the day drew to a close, Eleanor found herself pacing in her chambers. The cracks in the defense were glaring, but so too were the inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative. The newly uncovered records Claire had provided hinted at a man who had tried, in his own flawed way, to make a difference. But the question remained, was Daniel guilty of embezzlement, or was he a scapegoat in a larger scheme? Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Daniel himself, escorted by a bailiff. His presence startled her, and she quickly dismissed the bailiff, gesturing for Daniel to step inside. "This is highly irregular," she said, her tone stern but not unkind. Daniel's expression was calm, his voice low. "I know. But I needed to talk to you." Eleanor crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "About what?" He hesitated, then said, "You've seen the evidence. You know what they're saying about me. But you also know me, Eleanor. You know who I was. Who I am." Her heart clenched at the sound of her name spoken with such familiarity. She said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I've made mistakes, but I'm not a criminal. Please, Eleanor. Don't let them bury me without knowing the truth." Eleanor's resolve faltered as she looked into his eyes. For the first time in years, she saw the boy she had once trusted with everything. But trust, she knew, was a dangerous thing in the pursuit of justice. "This conversation never happened," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll do my job. I'll find the truth." Daniel nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you." As the door closed behind him, Eleanor sank into her chair, her mind racing. The cracks in the defense were growing, but so too were the questions she couldn't ignore. And in the shadows of those questions, she began to see the faint outlines of the truth. The evening sky outside the courthouse darkened as the trial reached the end of another grueling day. Judge Eleanor Hart's chambers were dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across the piles of case files scattered before her. She rubbed her temples, the weight of the trial pressing on her shoulders like a physical burden. The image of Daniel Cross, once a bright-eyed boy with dreams as big as hers, continued to haunt her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Claire. "Judge Hart, I've flagged something odd in Mr. Cross's employment history. It might warrant a closer look." Eleanor sat up, her curiosity piqued. Claire's instincts were rarely wrong. She opened the attached document and scanned its contents. Among the financial records was a curious detail: several large sums deposited into Daniel's account from a company called Meridian Holdings. The name struck a chord. Eleanor had encountered it in past cases, a corporation with a reputation for shadowy dealings. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Could this connection point to a larger scheme? The next day in court, the prosecution continued its relentless assault. Margaret Duval called another witness to the stand, Gerald Boyd, a former associate at Apex Solutions. Gerald's testimony was damning, detailing alleged meetings where Daniel had supposedly orchestrated the embezzlement. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by greed, his actions cold and calculated. Eleanor observed Daniel as the witness spoke. His expression remained calm, but there was a tension in his posture, as though he were holding something back. Eleanor's pen hovered over her notebook, her thoughts racing. Was he hiding guilt? Or was there something more? When Edward Chase rose for cross-examination, his attempt to discredit Gerald was clumsy at best. His questions lacked focus, and Margaret's objections came swiftly. Eleanor's frustration mounted. If Daniel truly was innocent, his defense team was failing him. During the recess, Eleanor found herself compelled to dig deeper. She returned to her chambers and called Claire. "Tell me everything you found on Meridian Holdings," she said. Claire hesitated. "They're involved in several shell companies. Most of their activities are above board, but there's a pattern of legal disputes involving fraud." "That's murky." Eleanor frowned. "Murky is an understatement. Find out if any of their subsidiaries have ties to Apex Solutions or the prosecution's witnesses." "On it," Claire replied. As Eleanor waited, her mind returned to the trial. The cracks in the prosecution's case were subtle but significant. The transactions tied to Daniel were meticulously detailed, but there was an underlying pattern that suggested orchestration, and not by Daniel alone. The question was, who was pulling the strings? That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. A court reporter, Kelly Hargrove, knocked hesitantly at her door. "Judge Hart," she began, her voice low, "I'm not sure if I should be telling you this, but there's talk in the courthouse. Whispers about someone tampering with the evidence." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What kind of tampering?" Kelly glanced over her shoulder as though checking for eavesdroppers. "Documents going missing. Witnesses being encouraged to testify a certain way. I don't have proof, but it's not the first time this has happened in cases involving Meridian Holdings." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Why tell me?" Kelly's gaze was steady. "Because you're the only one I trust to do something about it." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming forward. But be careful, Kelly. If what you're saying is true, this runs deep." The following day, Eleanor's suspicions were confirmed. Claire's research revealed a direct link between Meridian Holdings and Gerald Boyd, the prosecution's key witness. Payments from a Meridian subsidiary had been funneled into Gerald's accounts months before the trial began. It was enough to suggest coercion, or worse. Eleanor's heart raced as she pieced the puzzle together. Meridian Holdings wasn't just tangentially involved. They were orchestrating the narrative, using Daniel as a scapegoat to cover their tracks. In court, Eleanor's demeanor remained composed, but her resolve hardened. The defense called its first surprise witness, a whistleblower from Meridian Holdings. The man, nervous but determined, testified about the company's history of fraudulent activities and its efforts to manipulate legal outcomes. His testimony cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, planting seeds of uncertainty in the jury's minds. Margaret's cross-examination was fierce, but the whistleblower held firm, his statements corroborated by the documents Eleanor had reviewed the night before. For the first time, the prosecution's case seemed to falter. That night, Eleanor sat in her chambers, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. Daniel wasn't a saint, but he wasn't the mastermind behind the embezzlement. He had been a pawn, caught in a game played by powerful figures who saw him as expendable. The weight of this realization pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest. She had promised herself she would find the truth, and now she had it. But what would she do with it? Her gaze fell on the gavel resting on her desk, a symbol of the justice she had sworn to uphold. The path forward was clear, but it wouldn't be easy. The truth would shake the foundations of the case, and potentially her career. Eleanor took a deep breath, her resolve firm. Tomorrow she would ensure that justice was served, no matter the cost. The truth was within reach, but the battle was far from over. In the face of deceit and corruption, Eleanor stood as a beacon of integrity, determined to expose the lies and deliver the justice that had long eluded her old friend. And in the quiet stillness of her chambers, she prepared for the storm that lay ahead. The courtroom brimmed with a tense energy the next morning, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken anticipation. Judge Eleanor Hart took her seat on the bench, her movements deliberate and composed. She had spent the previous night wrestling with the decision she now faced, knowing that the path she chose would alter the course of the trial, and perhaps her career. The prosecution had built an intricate web of evidence, each thread meticulously placed to ensnare Daniel Cross. But Eleanor had seen the cracks, the subtle inconsistencies, and the shadowy connections to Meridian Holdings. The truth was there, lurking beneath layers of deception, waiting for someone brave enough to expose it. Today she would take that risk. Margaret Duval's voice cut through the murmurs as she called her next witness, an IT specialist who had analyzed the digital trail tied to Daniel's alleged offshore accounts. The witness's testimony was concise, technical, and damning, painting a picture of a man who had masterfully manipulated digital records to hide his crimes. Eleanor's gaze drifted to Daniel. His posture was stiff, his face carefully neutral. She could sense his frustration, his silent plea for someone to see beyond the surface. When Edward Chase rose for cross-examination, his approach was markedly different. The usual hesitance in his voice had given way to a quiet determination. He began by questioning the methodology of the IT specialist's analysis, pointing out potential flaws in their assumptions. While his efforts weren't groundbreaking, they were enough to plant a seed of doubt. Eleanor's attention shifted to the jury. Some members leaned forward, their expressions curious, while others exchanged uncertain glances. The cracks in the prosecution's narrative were becoming harder to ignore. During the lunch recess, Eleanor summoned Edward Chase to her chambers. He entered hesitantly, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cautious, "is there a problem?" Eleanor gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Chase, I need to speak with you candidly," she began, her tone firm but measured. "This trial hinges on more than just the evidence presented in court. There are external forces at play, and I believe your client is being used as a scapegoat." Edward's eyes widened. "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the desk. "I've uncovered connections between the prosecution's witnesses and a corporation with a history of manipulating legal outcomes. Meridian Holdings has ties to this case, and their involvement raises serious questions about the integrity of the evidence against Mr. Cross." Edward's expression shifted from surprise to determination. "What do you need me to do?" "Focus your cross-examination on those connections," Eleanor instructed. "Ask the questions that will force the prosecution to address these discrepancies. But be cautious. This is a dangerous gamble, and it could backfire if handled improperly." Edward nodded, his grip on the briefcase tightening. "Understood, Your Honor." "Thank you." As he left, Eleanor sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. She had crossed a line by intervening so directly, but she couldn't ignore the growing evidence of a larger conspiracy. Justice demanded more than impartiality, it required courage. The afternoon session began with a renewed intensity. Edward's cross-examination of the IT specialist resumed, but this time his questions took a sharper turn. "You've testified that these digital transactions were traced to accounts controlled by Mr. Cross," Edward began. "Were you aware that Meridian Holdings, a corporation with documented ties to fraud, has financial dealings with Apex Solutions?" The courtroom stirred as murmurs rippled through the audience. Margaret Duval's objection was immediate. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant and speculative," she said, her tone clipped. Eleanor's gavel struck the bench. "Overruled. Mr. Chase, proceed." Edward pressed on, presenting documents that Claire had unearthed. The evidence revealed payments from a Meridian subsidiary to Apex Solutions executives, as well as ties to Gerald Boyd. The connections painted a picture of collusion, suggesting that the evidence against Daniel had been manipulated to protect more powerful players. Margaret's attempts to discredit the documents were fierce, but Edward's newfound confidence held firm. The jury's attention remained riveted, their earlier skepticism now directed at the prosecution. As the day's session concluded, Eleanor returned to her chambers, her mind racing. The gamble had paid off for now. But she knew the repercussions would be swift and unforgiving. By allowing the defense to challenge the integrity of the prosecution's case, she had disrupted the carefully constructed narrative that had dominated the trial. The truth was emerging, but it came at a cost. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Claire, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "Your Honor, there's something you need to see," she said, placing a folder on the desk. Inside were more records tying Meridian Holdings to other high-profile cases, each one marked by similar patterns of evidence tampering and witness coercion. Eleanor's chest tightened. This wasn't just about Daniel Cross, it was about a system corrupted by greed and power. Exposing it would require more than a single trial. It would require a reckoning. The chapter closed with Eleanor standing at a crossroads. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but the stakes were too high to ignore. Daniel's fate, the integrity of the justice system, and her own principles were all on the line. As the city lights twinkled outside her window, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The morning dawned heavy with the weight of what was to come. Judge Eleanor Hart stood before her mirror, adjusting the lapels of her robe. Her reflection stared back at her, its eyes shadowed with fatigue but burning with resolve. Today she would be walking a razor's edge, risking everything she had worked for to uncover the truth. A truth that had been buried beneath lies and manipulation, its emergence threatening to disrupt not just this trial but the very system she had sworn to uphold. The courtroom was buzzing with subdued whispers as she entered. The jury filed in, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and fatigue. At the defense table, Daniel Cross sat with his attorney, Edward Chase, his posture tense but upright. Across the room, Margaret Duval conferred with her team, her sharp gaze darting toward Eleanor as if sensing the shift in momentum. Eleanor struck the gavel. "Court is now in session. Mr. Chase, you may proceed." Edward rose, his steps deliberate. "Your Honor, the defense would like to recall Gerald Boyd to the stand." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Gerald Boyd, the prosecution's star witness, had delivered damning testimony against Daniel earlier in the trial. Recalling him now was a bold move. Margaret Duval's objection came swiftly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Boyd has already testified extensively." Eleanor met Margaret's gaze evenly. "Overruled. Mr. Boyd's testimony is crucial to ensuring a fair trial." "Proceed, Mr. Chase." Gerald Boyd took the stand, his discomfort evident. His gaze flickered toward Margaret before settling on Edward, who approached with measured confidence. "Mr. Boyd," Edward began, his tone calm but firm, "during your previous testimony, you claimed that Mr. Cross orchestrated the embezzlement scheme. Is that correct?" Gerald nodded, his voice tight. "Yes." Edward held up a document. "Are you familiar with this financial record?" Gerald hesitated. I've seen it before. Can you confirm that this transaction originated from Meridian Holdings, a corporation with ties to Apex Solutions?" The tension in the room thickened as Gerald's face paled. I don't know. Edward's voice sharpened. Mr. Boyd, are you aware that this transaction was directed to your personal account? A payment made shortly before your initial statement to investigators? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Margaret's objection was immediate. Your Honor, this is an outrageous attempt to discredit my witness. Eleanor's gavel struck the bench. Order. Mr. Chase, I hope you have evidence to support this line of questioning. Edward produced another document. Your Honor, these bank records confirm that Mr. Boyd received significant payments from Meridian Holdings. These payments coincide with his testimony implicating my client. Gerald's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. I was just following orders. They said it was the right thing to do. Eleanor's voice cut through the murmurs. Who is they, Mr. Boyd? Gerald's gaze darted toward Margaret before dropping to the floor. Meridian Holdings. They approached me. Told me what to say. They said Daniel Cross was the perfect fall guy. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Eleanor's grip on her gavel tightened as she scanned the room, her judicial demeanor masking the storm raging within her. During the recess, Eleanor retreated to her chambers. Her hands shook as she poured herself a cup of tea. Gerald Boyd's confession had thrown the trial into chaos, but it had also validated her suspicions. Meridian Holdings' involvement was no longer conjecture, it was fact. Yet the implications were staggering. This wasn't just about Daniel Cross. It was about a systemic corruption that reached far beyond this courtroom. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Claire, her expression grim. Your Honor, you need to see this, Claire said, handing over a folder. Inside were documents linking Meridian Holdings to several high-profile cases, each marked by similar patterns of evidence tampering and witness manipulation. Eleanor's breath caught. This was bigger than she had imagined. Thank you, Claire, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Keep digging. We need everything we can find. The afternoon session began with Margaret Duval on the defensive. She called an emergency meeting with her team, and when the trial resumed, her demeanor was noticeably strained. Eleanor watched as Margaret attempted to regain control, calling a forensic accountant to discredit the new evidence. But the jury's trust had been shaken, and the accountant's testimony did little to repair the damage. Edward, sensing an opportunity, capitalized on the prosecution's faltering narrative. He introduced additional witnesses, former employees of Meridian Holdings, who testified about the corporation's history of manipulation and coercion. Each revelation further eroded the prosecution's case. That evening, Eleanor returned to her chambers, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. The trial was nearing its climax, and the stakes had never been higher. She sat at her desk, the documents Claire had uncovered spread out before her. The picture they painted was damning, a network of power and greed that had ensnared countless lives. Eleanor's thoughts turned to Daniel. He was no saint, but he was also not the criminal the prosecution had made him out to be. He was a victim caught in a web spun by forces far beyond his control. And now, thanks to Gerald Boyd's confession, the truth was finally coming to light. But there was still a long way to go. The battle was far from over, and Eleanor knew that the coming days would test her resolve like never before. As she stared out the window at the city lights, she made a silent vow. She would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The revelations of the day had shifted the tide, but the waters were still treacherous. Eleanor stood at the heart of the storm, a beacon of integrity in a sea of corruption. And as the city settled into the quiet of night, she prepared herself for the battles yet to come, her determination burning brighter than ever. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as Judge Eleanor Hart took her seat. Outside, the city awoke under a blanket of gray clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. Inside, the tension was palpable. The revelations of the previous day had shattered the prosecution's carefully constructed case, exposing a web of deceit that pointed directly to Meridian Holdings. Yet the battle was far from over. Eleanor struck the gavel, silencing the murmurs. Court is now in session. Mr. Chase, you may continue with the defense's case. Edward Chase rose from his seat, his movements more assured than they had been at the trial's start. The tides had turned, and with them his confidence. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Benjamin Clark to the stand." Another ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Benjamin Clark, a former senior executive at Meridian Holdings, had been a shadowy figure throughout the trial. His sudden appearance as a witness hinted at more shocking revelations. Benjamin entered the courtroom, his demeanor cool and composed. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Eleanor watched him closely, noting the tension in his jaw and the subtle tremor in his hands. This was a man who carried secrets that could unravel everything. Edward approached with measured steps. "Mr. Clark, can you describe your role at Meridian Holdings?" Benjamin's voice was steady. "I served as the chief financial officer for 8 years. And during your tenure, were you aware of any fraudulent activities within the company?" Margaret Duval's objection was immediate. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant to the charges against Mr. Cross." Eleanor's gavel struck the bench. "Overruled. Mr. Clark's testimony is directly tied to the credibility of the evidence presented in this case. Proceed, Mr. Chase." Edward nodded. "Mr. Clark, please answer the question." Benjamin's hesitation was brief but telling. "Yes, I was aware of fraudulent activities." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Eleanor's grip on her gavel tightened, her eyes locked on Benjamin. Edward pressed on. "Can you elaborate?" Benjamin sighed, his composure faltering. "Meridian Holdings has a history of manipulating financial records, pressuring employees to falsify documents, and coercing witnesses in legal proceedings. It's a systematic effort to protect the company's interests at any cost. Was Mr. Cross involved in these activities?" "No," Benjamin said firmly. "He was a convenient scapegoat. The real orchestrators needed someone to take the fall, and he was an easy target." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Margaret's objections grew more frantic, but Eleanor's firm rulings allowed the testimony to continue. Each word from Benjamin peeled back another layer of the conspiracy, painting a damning picture of Meridian Holdings. During the lunch recess, Eleanor retreated to her chambers. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a cup of tea. The weight of the truth threatened to crush her. She had always believed in the justice system, but this case had exposed its vulnerabilities. Meridian Holdings' reach was insidious, its power extending into corners of society she had once thought untouchable. Claire entered, a file in hand. "Your Honor, I found more. Payments, emails, even internal memos. Meridian Holdings has been manipulating trials for years. This case is just the tip of the iceberg." Eleanor took the file, her heart sinking as she scanned its contents. The evidence was damning, implicating not just corporate executives but also government officials, law enforcement, and even members of the judiciary. The system was more corrupt than she had feared. "Thank you, Claire," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "This will be critical." The afternoon session resumed with Eleanor's resolve hardened. Margaret Duval called her final witness, a forensic expert who attempted to salvage the prosecution's case by reaffirming the validity of the digital evidence against Daniel. But the defense's earlier revelations had sown too much doubt. The jury's expressions ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. Edward's cross-examination was sharp and focused. He highlighted the connections between the forensic expert and Meridian Holdings, exposing potential conflicts of interest. By the time the expert stepped down, the prosecution's case was in tatters. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers. The trial was nearing its conclusion, but the battle was far from over. The revelations had shifted the tide, but they had also painted a target on her back. Exposing Meridian Holdings would come at a cost, and Eleanor knew she would face intense scrutiny and backlash. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Daniel, escorted by a bailiff. His expression was a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low, "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything." Eleanor met his gaze. "The truth deserves to be heard, Mr. Cross. That's my duty." Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. No matter what happens, you've given me hope. And that's more than I've had in a long time. As he left, Eleanor felt a flicker of resolve reignite within her. This trial was about more than Daniel Cross. It was about restoring faith in a broken system and holding those in power accountable. The courtroom had become a battleground, but she would not falter. The truth was dangerous, but it was also necessary. As the rain began to fall outside her window, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would see this through no matter the cost. Justice demanded nothing less. The courthouse buzzed with restless energy as the trial approached its climax. The case against Daniel Cross had been fractured, its once solid foundation shaken by revelations of corruption and manipulation. Yet the question remained, would the truth be enough to sway the jury and deliver justice? Judge Eleanor Hart stood before her mirror that morning, her reflection a mixture of determination and weariness. She adjusted her robe and straightened her spine. Today would test her resolve like no day before. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for justice. It had become a battlefield where integrity clashed with deceit. As Eleanor entered the courtroom, the familiar gavel in her hand, the room fell silent. Jurors sat with pens poised, reporters filled the gallery, and the tension was thick enough to taste. Eleanor's voice rang clear as she declared the session in order. "Mr. Chase, are you prepared to deliver the defense's closing arguments?" Edward Chase stood, his once nervous demeanor replaced by a quiet confidence. "Yes, Your Honor." Edward approached the jury, his footsteps deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the evidence, seen the documents, and listened to the witnesses. At first glance, this case seems straightforward. Daniel Cross, a man accused of betraying his company and defrauding investors. But as we have uncovered, the truth is far more complex." He gestured toward Daniel. "My client is not a perfect man. He has made mistakes, as we all have. But mistakes do not make him a criminal. What makes a criminal is intent, the deliberate choice to harm others for personal gain. And the evidence shows that Daniel Cross was not the mastermind behind this scheme. He was a pawn, set up by those who wield power without accountability." Edward's voice grew stronger. "Consider the testimony of Gerald Boyd, who admitted under oath that he was coerced by Meridian Holdings. Consider the financial records that reveal a pattern of corruption and manipulation extending far beyond this courtroom. And most importantly, consider the reasonable doubt that now surrounds the prosecution's case." He stepped closer to the jury box. "You have a choice to make. Will you convict an innocent man based on a narrative crafted by those who seek to hide their own guilt? Or will you stand for justice, even when it means challenging the powerful?" Edward returned to his seat, his final words lingering in the charged silence. "I trust you will choose wisely." Margaret Duval rose, her expression composed but her movements tense. She approached the jury with measured steps, her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense has presented an intricate web of theories and accusations. They would have you believe that Daniel Cross is a victim, a scapegoat in a larger conspiracy. But let us not lose sight of the facts." She gestured toward the evidence display. "The digital trail ties directly to Mr. Cross. The financial records, the offshore accounts, the altered documents, all point to his involvement. These are not coincidences. They are the actions of someone who sought to exploit his position for personal gain." Margaret's gaze swept the jury. "Do not let the defense's distractions cloud your judgment. This case is about accountability. Daniel Cross betrayed the trust of those who believed in him, and it is your duty to hold him accountable." She returned to her seat, her expression resolute. "The evidence speaks for itself." The jury deliberated for hours, their discussions punctuated by heated arguments and hushed exchanges. Eleanor remained in her chambers, her hands clasped tightly as she stared out the window. The weight of the case pressed heavily on her, each passing moment a reminder of the stakes. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was silent. Eleanor took her seat, her face a mask of calm. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreperson stood, a folded piece of paper in hand. "Yes, Your Honor." The bailiff delivered the paper to Eleanor, who unfolded it carefully. Her eyes scanned the words, her heart pounding. She handed the paper back to the foreperson. Please read the verdict, she said. The foreperson's voice was steady. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant, Daniel Cross, not guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a murmur of voices. Eleanor struck her gavel, restoring order. The jury is dismissed, she said. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel approached Eleanor. His expression was a mixture of relief and gratitude. Thank you, he said simply. Eleanor nodded. The truth deserved to be heard. Take this second chance and make it count. Later that evening, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers, the weight of the trial finally lifting. The fight for justice had been arduous, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in the importance of integrity and courage. She knew that the battle against corruption was far from over, but for now she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. The trial had been won, but the war against injustice continued. And as long as there were truths to uncover and battles to fight, Eleanor Hart would be there, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The courthouse stood silent under a pale morning sun. Its grand facade seemed less imposing now, as though the echoes of justice reverberating through its halls had softened its edges. Judge Eleanor Hart stepped through its doors for what she hoped would be the last time in this case. Today was not a trial day, but the weight of the aftermath demanded her presence. The verdict had been rendered. Daniel Cross had walked free, exonerated by a jury that had seen through the lies and manipulations. Yet the victory felt bittersweet. The revelations about Meridian Holdings had peeled back layers of corruption, exposing a rot that extended far beyond this courtroom. The battle against injustice was far from over. Eleanor's chambers were quiet, her desk cleared of the mountains of evidence that had consumed her life for weeks. She sat with her hands clasped, staring at a single folder, a comprehensive report on Meridian Holdings' activities, compiled by Claire and her team. This folder would be her weapon in the next fight. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Claire, her expression a mixture of relief and determination. Your Honor, the press conference is set up, Claire said. Are you ready? Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. Let's do this. Eleanor stepped into the courthouse lobby, where reporters had gathered en masse. The air was electric with anticipation, cameras flashing as microphones were thrust forward. Eleanor stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. Good morning, she began, her voice steady. As many of you know, the trial of Daniel Cross revealed truths far more significant than the charges against one man. It exposed a systemic issue, a network of corruption and manipulation that has undermined the integrity of our justice system. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Meridian Holdings has operated in the shadows for years, using its influence to manipulate outcomes, coerce witnesses, and protect its own interests. The evidence presented in this trial is just the beginning. I am calling for a full federal investigation into the corporation and its affiliates. The reporters erupted into a flurry of questions, but Eleanor raised a hand to silence them. This is not just about one company or one case, she continued. It is about restoring faith in our system and ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. She stepped away from the podium, ignoring the barrage of questions. Claire was waiting for her, a rare smile on her face. You handled that perfectly, Claire said. Eleanor gave a small nod. Let's hope it's enough to spark action. Later that afternoon, Eleanor met with Daniel Cross in her chambers. He entered cautiously, his movements still marked by the tension of weeks under scrutiny. But there was a lightness to him now, a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Your Honor, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Thank you for everything. I don't know how to repay you. Eleanor gestured for him to sit. You don't owe me anything, Daniel. What matters is what you do with your life moving forward. You have a second chance. Use it wisely. Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. I've been thinking about that. About how I can make things right. I've reached out to some of the investors who lost money, offered to help them rebuild. It's not much, but it's a start. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. That's a good start. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and making amends. Daniel stood, his posture more confident. "Thank you, Your Honor, for believing in me." Eleanor watched him leave, a sense of quiet pride settling over her. She had done her part, now it was up to him to write the next chapter of his life. Over the following weeks, the federal investigation into Meridian Holdings gained momentum. Whistleblowers came forward, bolstered by the trial's outcome and Eleanor's public stance. The media covered the story relentlessly, turning Meridian Holdings into a symbol of unchecked corporate power. Eleanor continued to work behind the scenes, providing key insights and supporting the investigators. Her chambers became a hub of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation she had grown accustomed to. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. One evening, as she was leaving the courthouse, a reporter caught up with her. "Judge Hart, do you believe this investigation will lead to meaningful change?" he asked. Eleanor paused, considering her words. "Change is never easy and it's rarely quick. But every step we take toward accountability and transparency is a step worth taking. I believe in the power of truth and I believe in the people fighting for it." Months later, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair at home, a cup of tea in her hands. The investigation into Meridian Holdings had led to several indictments, and the corporation's influence was finally waning. It was a victory, but it had come at a cost. Eleanor had faced criticism, threats, and moments of doubt. Yet she had persevered. She thought of Daniel, of the jury, of everyone who had been touched by this case. It was a reminder that justice was not a single act but a continuous effort. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, she felt ready to face it. As the evening light faded, Eleanor glanced at the stack of new case files on her desk. The work never ended, but she wouldn't have it any other way. With a deep breath, she rose and returned to her desk, her resolve unwavering.